The first time I saw the yellow slip pinned to my snow-frosted mailbox, it looked like a warning flag stuck in a drift. Replace the mailbox in 10 days or face a $50 daily penalty. In a cul-de-sac where snowplows hummed like distant bees and porch lights glowed soft against the early dusk, the demand landed like a dare. I could almost hear the board counting down. 10 days. 50 a day. Would I fold and swap it out, or would I pay for every stubborn sunrise? This wasn't a Mansion Street or a crime story, it was the quiet white noise kind of winter that settles over a neighborhood and makes you think nothing big ever happens here. The sky was the color of unsharpened pencils. The maples were knuckled with frost. My kids had stamped a crooked trail of boot prints from driveway to door, and those prints made a ragged border around the real scene of the crime, a weathered cedar post and a bronze box with a hand-brushed patina, topped with a small copper cardinal that caught the morning's pale light. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't neon. It didn't sing. It just stood there, neat and solid, a little more charming than the standard issue aluminum mailboxes our association preferred, like a uniform for a parade no one asked to march in. The slip used clipped phrases, as if courtesy were rationed in winter. Immediate correction required. 10 days from date of notice. Failure to comply will result in administrative fines. I could picture the meeting where someone decided that a mailbox with a copper bird was a threat to harmony. There had to be a face behind the paper. And there was. We called her Ms. V. Not to her face, because even I try to be better than that. She wore envy like a scarf and kept meticulous records of the things other people did. She never waved, only tilted her chin as if acknowledging that you existed and might someday be called upon to justify that choice. The morning the notice appeared, she cruised past in a compact SUV, tires crunching over the frozen ruts, and dipped her chin a fraction lower when she saw me reading the paper. The wind stitched through the pines near the pond and carried a hint of metallic cold, like coins in a fist. I stood there with the yellow slip in my glove and told myself to breathe. 10 days felt like the kind of clock someone starts because they enjoy hearing it tick. I could replace the mailbox. I could drop $100 on a regulation one and call it done. But I had not installed the cedar post on a whim. I said it 2 summers earlier with my uncle, who taught me to tamp gravel like you mean it. We had measured the setback from the curb, checked the post height for the postal carrier, and made sure the door cleared the snow when plows piled slush along the street. I still had the little notebook where we scrawled the numbers, a ghost of pencil on graph paper. Maybe the board didn't care how much care I took. Maybe the point wasn't order at all. Maybe the point was power, and the favoring of dull uniformity over harmless individuality. I folded the notice and slipped it into my jacket pocket. The copper cardinal winked at me from its little perch. 10 days, the paper warned. But a warning is just a draw of lines in the snow. Lines can be redrawn. Our association ran like a winter watch, always patrolling, always looking for infractions that spoiled their idea of perfection. The governing documents came as a glossy binder when we moved in, with a photo of the pond at sunset and an index of rules arranged like chapters in a how-to for living quietly. But a binder that starts with a photo doesn't fool you when you find the list of penalties tucked behind the friendly language. A rule is still a rule even if it smiles. Where the binder stops being vacation brochure and starts being barbed wire is the section called architectural uniformity. Color palettes for shutters and siding. Approved mailbox models and streetlights. Fence height to the inch. You could swap a small detail here or there if you asked for permission first, and if you didn't, the board could pinch your life with notices until you begged to fit back into their idea of a neighborhood. When the snow came early this year, the board seemed to feed on the hush. Everyone was inside, everyone was easy to watch. I first heard about their winter crackdown the night before the notice appeared. A neighbor shared that driveways with non-conforming decorative items were on the list. The post-holiday wreaths with bows? Fine. The colored porch bulbs? A tolerance window. The mailboxes? Strictly standard, according to a passage I had skimmed before but never believed anyone would enforce. In that passage, a specific line glowed with retroactive menace, CCR Section 4.3 Mailbox Rule, requiring association-approved design, finish, and placement to maintain a uniform streetscape. The words were small, but the intent was not. I remember copying the line into my phone, thinking it was a relic of an earlier, pettier era. I saved it anyway, an evidence prop for a problem I hoped I wouldn't have. The nosy neighbor part of this story will sound familiar if you've ever lived under rules that turn adults into hall monitors. Ms. V treated the block like a ledger filled with other people's entries. She walked the same loop at the same time, winter or not, with a narrow-shouldered coat and a clipboard tucked in her bag. I never saw the clipboard, but I saw the way she tracked details with her eyes. The message traveled. The board had formed a compliance subcommittee for winter. Peer-reported observations welcomed. I pictured them gathering near the clubhouse fireplace with mugs of tea and that slightly hungry look committees get when they think they've found their purpose. I pictured my little copper bird on the agenda. And here's the detail that slid in under the front door: the mailbox wasn't just a pretty fixture. I had installed it within the Postal Service's guidelines. A friend had told me once about federal rules that governed mailbox height and accessibility. I didn't have a law degree, but I respected the kind of order that serves a function. I had the USPS guidance saved in a folder labeled Home. In that folder sat an excerpt from the domestic mail manual that spoke to location and clearance, the sort of dry instructions that make sense when you picture a carrier driving down a route in snow. That document would matter, I didn't know how yet. Another quiet evidence prop, waiting under a layer of digital frost. When I unfolded the notice on the kitchen island that morning, the paper left a faint damp ring from where a wet glove had smudged it. The letterhead used a serif font as if typography could make a penalty elegant. It said my mailbox was a non-approved structure and must be replaced with one of the association's listed models. It listed 3 product codes and color numbers. It gave a deadline 10 days from the date printed at the top. The date was January 5th. The countdown had begun without me even seeing it. It reminded me of those winter puzzles where a dot of salt melts ice from the underside. You don't see the shift until your boot slips. I leaned on the counter and listened to the faint hum of the furnace. Outside the window, the snow along the curb line was cut like a serrated cake by earlier plows, and light seeped through the overcast as if the sun were tired. I swallowed the first reaction and read the second paragraph again. If not corrected within the stated period, fines of $50 per day may apply until the violation is remedied. The phrasing gave themselves room. May apply. Discretion is the comfortable chair power sits in. I think the board expected compliance without conversation. The notice even used a line I've since learned is boilerplate: communication about this matter must be in writing to the management company. No names, just an email address and a P.O. box. But a neighborhood isn't a call center, and I knew exactly whose eyes had directed attention to my mailbox. The line of footprints from the street to my box wasn't from the mail carrier. The pattern told me the visitor had approached from the sidewalk, not the road. The shoe tread was narrow. The gait favored the left foot. Maybe I was reading too much into snow. Or maybe I had lived here long enough to know the language of it. Here's the plain problem: the uniform mailbox our association wanted was flimsy in winter. The lids iced shut. The posts shifted in freeze-thaw. The bolts rusted in a season. I had replaced one already, the year before, using their approved model, and when the hinge failed, the management company shrugged at me. Replace it again, they said in a bulletin full of soft scoldings. That's when I chose the cedar post and bronze box. I did not wish to be difficult. I wished to be done with things that break because they are chosen for appearance, not function. The cedar post survived 3 storms without budging. The bronze box swung open even when ice rimed the latch. The carrier told me, in passing and politely, that it was easy to reach and sheltered from slush spray. That mattered more to me than a model number. I know some people hear this and think it's silly to make a stand over a mailbox. But tiny things are where power tests itself. If you yield on the useful, the pointless gets bolder. I put the notice in a clear plastic sleeve and clipped it to the fridge. Then I pulled out the binder and flagged CCR section 4.3 with a yellow tab. I also printed the USPS guidance on mailbox installation and tucked it behind the CCR tab, as if storing tinder near a match I wasn't sure I'd strike. The paper smelled faintly of toner and warm plastic. Outside, a light snow started again, a hush you could hear against the window. This neighborhood was designed to look like a winter card, and on certain evenings, it achieved that trick. But a card doesn't show you the meetings, the minutes, the petty votes. I'd learned names but not friendships. I'd learned the board's rhythm but not their hearts. Ms. V had a talent for pointing and saying this isn't like the others, and I had a talent for smiling and not moving. On day 1 of 10, I decided to set the clock to my own time. The first thing I did was document everything. The mailbox itself, photos from the street, the driveway, the carrier's angle. Measurements, from the road surface to the bottom of the box opening, from the curb edge to the post center line. I wrote those numbers down in the same notebook I'd used 2 summers earlier. 41 inches to the bottom lip. 7 inches back from the curb's edge. Post plumb, footing sound. I took a picture of the footing cap where it rose a breath above the snow and made note that the gravel base drained meltwater away from the pole. If the board wanted to make this about compliance, I would speak compliance fluently. The second thing I did was read the fine print on the notice a third time. It referenced the mailbox rule by number. It also referenced the authority of the architectural guidelines, a separate booklet that lists the approved components like a small catalog. In that booklet, the mailboxes all looked identical in the glossy photos. But the booklet didn't mention postal clearance. It talked about aesthetics, harmony, continuity. That was my thread to pull. If a rule enforces appearance at the cost of function, you can hold it up to the light and show the holes. I wasn't a lawyer and didn't plan to play one. I also wasn't looking to start a war on my block. But I knew the difference between a neighborly preference and a committee's overreach. The federal guidance didn't grant me license to do anything I wanted. It just established a baseline so carriers could work safely. It mattered that my mailbox met that baseline. It mattered that the board's demand would nudge me toward an option worse for the person actually using the mailbox every day. By late afternoon, the clouds thinned a little, and the light sharpened on the snow like chalk on slate. I printed another document, a map of our street with the snowplow path penciled in from last winter, where the blade had thrown slush in a regular arc just past the gutter. I marked where the approved posts tended to lean come March. It looked like a child's drawing, but I liked having evidence that wasn't just a feeling. I labeled the page and slid it into the same clear sleeve as the USPS guidance. These would be my first evidence props if I needed them. CCR Section 4.3 Mailbox Rule flagged on paper, the Domestic Mail Manual excerpt, and my snowplow sketch. Around dinnertime, word flickered through the neighborhood text group that a few others had received notices too. A decorative house number plaque too near the sidewalk. A set of planters in winter colors deemed non-compliant. A porch swing visible from the street. The board had discovered that winter reveals and removes, and they were using that to tidy what they didn't like. Each person typed their frustration. Each person added a shrugging emoji as if this were just one of those things. But a shrug is just a sigh with smaller lungs. I typed that I'd received a notice about my mailbox. A few neighbors sent sympathy. One sent me the board's latest agenda for their monthly meeting, a PDF with bullet points. Down near the bottom, I found a line that made my scalp tighten: Winter Uniformity Initiative Update, Nonconforming Elements List and Enforcement Timeline. The words were so tidy you could miss the bite in them. I saved the agenda, another paper for my folder. That night, the wind leaned against the corner of the house and whistled once through a tiny gap like a kettle letting off quiet steam. I sat at the kitchen table and wrote down the plan without calling it a plan. Document. Compare rules with postal guidance. Ask for clarity in writing. Rally only if pushed. I imagined someone in a cardigan picturing me meekly swapping my mailbox for a flimsy clone. The picture they held would have to fade. The next morning, day 2, the snow glittered like sifted sugar where the plow had flexed its muscle down the road. The copper cardinal carried a tiny hat of frost. I snapped a photo because I knew beauty could be its own witness. Then I drafted my first letter to the management company. It was not a defense speech and it was not a tantrum. It was a request for clarification on the basis for the notice, a reference to the postal guidance that controls safety and access, and a question about whether the board had considered function during a season when function becomes survival. I attached the USPS excerpt and my measurements. I cited CCR section 4.3 by number, not anger. I asked for a copy of the approved mailbox model specifications regarding latch clearance in ice. I kept my tone even. I pressed send, and in that moment, the clock and I stopped obeying each other. The management company sent an automated receipt. That was fine. Every piece of paper, visible or electronic, was a reef I could stand on if the water rose. I printed the confirmation and slid it behind the first stack of props. A neighborhood like ours loves appearances. I would appear methodical. Around noon, the person I think of as the treasurer drove by, his sedan moving at the careful pace of someone who believes in rules the way other people believe in vitamins. He glanced at the mailbox and then at the front of our house, as if maybe a banner denouncing uniformity would be fluttering. There was no banner. There was just the smell of soup on the stove and the small thrill that comes from feeling the hinge of a story give under your hand. The association calls it harmony. It feels like sameness in a coat and tie. But sameness can't survive a good question, and I had one. If uniformity is the goal, whose comfort are we preserving? The board's sense of control? A neighbor's need to match? Or the postal carrier's need to reach a box in knee-high slush without dislocating their shoulder? I didn't type that part. I wrote it in my notebook where annoyance can go to cool down and become strategy. Later, just before twilight laid a lavender ribbon over the snow, I saw Ms. V again. She paused near my driveway and inspected something in the street like a detective in a show. The sun was so low it snuck under the clouds and flamed briefly on the copper cardinal. I took that as a good omen. She took it, I suspect, as provocation. Power loves to think a glint is a gauntlet. Day 3 brought the first official reply. It was the most unsurprising thing, a restatement of the requirement to install an approved model to maintain community standards, and a reminder that failure to comply may result in daily fines. No engagement with my questions, no acknowledgement of the postal guidance. The form letter had the warmth of a winter doorknob. That was intentional. If they kept the conversation cold, they could make me the only one shivering. So I went for warmth where it still lived. I spoke to neighbors individually, stepping carefully along shoveled paths. I kept it neighborly. I didn't rally, I checked in. Someone else had been told to remove a wind chime because it was audible beyond the property in winter air. Someone else had to move a bench. No one wanted a fight. But every person I spoke with said the same thing when they looked at my mailbox: that looks better than the standard ones, and it actually works when the ice comes. I wrote those comments down, not as testimony, but as weather reports from the community. Between these conversations and my folder of documents, I started to feel the shape of a fair argument, the kind that can't be dismissed as personal preference. Winter has its own soundtrack: the squeak of boots on packed snow, the far scrape of a shovel, the hollow hush inside a scarf. Our soundtrack got a new instrument that week, the tick of my own internal metronome counting down the 10 days while I built a counterclockwork. I could feel the board waiting for me to flinch. I decided to wait back. On day 4, I printed something else, a page from the welcome packet that all new residents receive, an excerpt that says the association aims to balance aesthetic standards with practical considerations for safety and accessibility. It's the kind of line that's easy to write and easier to ignore. I highlighted it anyway. I labeled it Board Packet Excerpt, Practicality Standard. It felt like a quote I could slide across a table, the way you do when someone has forgotten their own mission statement. I tucked it behind the CCR tab. Quiet prop, ready. The snow came heavier that afternoon. The sky went the color of a dull spoon, and the flakes fell stern and steady. Invisible traffic built on our group text, with more notices trickling in. People were grumpy. People were resigned. I stayed polite in the thread and then typed my own note to the management company again, this time referencing the line in the welcome packet and asking for a written explanation of how the approved mailbox models meet safety and accessibility during winter conditions, including latch function and plow spray. I said I would appreciate the board's consideration of a variance for functional designs that meet postal standards and are comparable in appearance. Comparable is such a useful word when power clings to aesthetics. I added a line thanking them for their time. I sent it, printed it, and put it in the folder. At dusk, our carrier left a piece of first-class mail and a bundle of catalogs that smelled faintly of perfume even through the cold. I noticed how the bronze door swung without sticking. I noticed the arc of spray left by a passing plow freeze on the curb but not on the latch. I wrote that down too. A story becomes convincing one detail at a time. 10 days is not a deadline when you push back with receipts, it's a fuse. The board lit it for a routine compliance scare, but they hadn't planned on meeting a homeowner who could count each inch, cite their own files, and ask the one question their binder didn't want to answer: what happens when uniformity contradicts function? The countdown kept ticking toward day 10. The real question wasn't whether I would pay $50 a day. It was whether their winter crackdown would survive the one rule they seemed to forget: communities run on people, not matching parts. Day 5 looked like powdered sugar dusted across the cul-de-sac, and the plow's low rumble stitched a baseline under the morning. I kept steady, logging temperatures, noting where the slush froze and where it ran. That might sound obsessive, but winter tests the design of small things, and I wanted a clean ledger when someone finally looked closely. Midday, the management company replied again with the same form paragraph, as if copying and pasting counted as authority. They attached a photo of an approved mailbox, circling its glossy finish like a product ad. They still ignored my questions about latch function in ICE and the postal guidance I had offered in good faith. Now the clock's sound felt different. 10 days wasn't a suggestion, it was a drumbeat meant to rattle the less stubborn. I wrote in my notebook that the board's silence on function was itself an answer, and I drew a thin line toward what needed to happen next. I prepared a variance request with my measurements and photographs, flagged to CCR Section 4.3, and referenced the welcome packet's note about balancing aesthetics with practical safety. I added the domestic mail manual excerpt as Exhibit A and my snowplow map as Exhibit B. It read like a mini brief without the drama. I wasn't trying to win a courtroom scene, I was forcing the committee to speak to the real world. By day 6, the air bit at exposed skin, and ice crystals tinkled against the bronze box like tiny bells. I slid my variance request into both email and certified mail, because paper that travels with a signature tends to gather respect. On the envelope, I wrote Management Company, Attention, Architectural Committee, and underlined it once. I added one more evidence prop to my folder, the certified mail receipt with its tracking number typed in blocky ink. If anyone later claimed I'd ignored the process, the paper would answer for me. Some neighbors began to thaw toward the idea that this wasn't just about my mailbox at all. A couple blocks over, the approved models had started failing in the deep freeze. One hinge snapped, another door warped and wouldn't close. The management company told those owners to purchase replacements and submit receipts for potential reimbursement after review. Potential was the polite cousin of maybe. I noted those stories because they weren't anger, they were data points. The board had chosen a design that looked matching in June and failed at its job in January. Day 7, the light hung flat and gray, the kind of sky that keeps your shadow on a tight leash. I shoveled the drive, listening to the scratch of the blade and the faint tap of icicles dripping, and I realized the board was probably taking bets on whether I'd fold at the last minute. Instead, I shifted from patience to pressure. I wrote a second letter to the management company, calm and direct, asking that the variance request be added to the docket for the next board meeting and that I be allowed to submit a short written statement to accompany it. I included a single-page summary that linked each of my measurements to the postal guidance. I was done letting them frame the conversation as an aesthetic dispute. I framed it as safety and good stewardship. That afternoon, a PDF arrived from the manager. Board agenda, January meeting. It listed new business items, and there it was, variance request, mailbox, 14 Meadow Point. The line stood plain and small, but reading it felt like turning a key. I saved the PDF as another evidence prop and printed a hard copy, highlighting the agenda line in yellow. The meeting was scheduled for January 12th. The clock and I had a date. On day 8, the air was so cold that exhalations curled briefly into visible questions before disappearing. Ms. V glided past on her loop, a speck of bright scarf against the pale world, and paused at the end of my drive as if taking the temperature of the street. I kept raking light snow off the box, casual in motion, very deliberate in purpose. She wouldn't speak, but she didn't need to. The posture announced a smug certainty that uniformity would prevail because it always had. Maybe in other winters. This one came with paper. Around noon, the management company delivered a new document, stamped in the top corner in red, final notice dated January 12th. Replace your mailbox within 48 hours or fines of $50 per day will commence without further warning. The notice was an escalation in tone and in ink color, but not in logic. It ignored my variance request as if letters to a P.O. box vanish on contact. I slipped the final notice behind the front page of my folder like you press a new leaf in a heavy book. I wrote in the margin of my notebook, "They tightened the screws, answer with light and facts." The evening smelled like wood smoke, a neighbor's chimney praising the old ways. I sat at the table and drafted the written statement I'd asked to submit. I kept it to 2 pages, single-spaced, with short paragraphs and clear headers: safety and function, evidence of compliance, comparable appearance, and precedent. Under precedent, I listed 2 homes, one from 3 winters ago with a variance for a modified porch light due to glare, and another from last spring for a custom fence design approved after function-based arguments. I didn't blame, and I didn't boast. I placed their own words and actions next to my request and let the match show. The board met that Wednesday evening, and the clubhouse windows glowed like squares of butter through the dusk. I watched from my driveway as a few cars trickled in, tires hissing on packed snow. I had sent my written statement and evidence packet by noon, with the subject line variance request, mailbox, safety and compliance. I imagined the packet sitting in a stack, maybe under a plate of cookies someone brought. Power loves sugar when it has to swallow a stubborn fact. I didn't show up in person. The meeting wasn't open for homeowner comments on new business. But I used the tools available. I set a simple timer tied to the meeting hour and gave myself one task while they discussed my case: shovel the walkway of Mrs. D across the street. She's older and moves carefully in winter. The board's rules take note of holiday bows but not aging knees. The scrape of my shovel and the bite of clean air kept me from pacing holes in my rug. When I finished, I stood for a long minute and watched the snowplow scrape past, its blade sending up a spray that glittered in the clubhouse lights like ground glass. Later that night, the manager emailed me the outcome. The architectural committee had denied the variance. The explanation used elegant grammar to say nothing. The committee finds that uniformity must be preserved and alternative models cannot be allowed at this time. There was no mention of safety, no reply to the postal guidance, and no acknowledgement of my measurements. It looked like a paragraph copied from an old decision, which made it worse. They weren't thinking, they were defending tradition by reflex. I put the denial beside the final notice in my folder and felt the pivot in my chest that means escalation. I wasn't going to yell into a void. I was going to change the room the void lived in. The stakes shifted from a tidy deadline to a bill in waiting, and the math was ugly. $50 a day for a winter-long fight was a quiet bleed. Multiply that by the committee's habit of ignoring function, and you don't just have a fine, you have a financing plan for control. The question wasn't if I could afford it. It was whether our street could afford a board that pretends compliance is free when it costs the people doing the living. I wrote a short update to the neighbors who'd reached out. I kept it factual. The variance was denied. The final notice set a 48-hour clock. The board's decision made no mention of the carrier, safety, or the welcome packet's practicality standard. I added that I would be submitting an appeal through the formal process described in the bylaws and that I would share any information that might help others. I didn't call for a march. I called for attention. Attention is oxygen for truth. The next morning, day 9, the cold softened a notch. A thin crust sat over the snow like a glaze, and the sun tried to punch through. I started the formal appeal, which required a fee, small but symbolic, and a statement of grounds. I referenced everything I'd already submitted, then added one more piece of evidence, a short video I had recorded the day before of the plow passing and the bronze door opening smoothly with one mittened hand afterward. I bookmarked the video stills with timestamps. Evidence doesn't have to be dramatic to be decisive, it has to be relevant. While the appeal packet printed, I received a surprise. A neighbor 2 houses down, who always waved from under a knit hat, forwarded me a copy of the board's Winter Uniformity Initiative report from the meeting. It was a bullet list, simple and bland except for one line: high visibility enforcement communicates standards and deeders non-compliance. The phrasing pricked like nettles. I added the report to my folder, underlining that one sentence. High visibility enforcement was a polite way of saying they liked making examples. The afternoon brought the first mention of the fine schedule applied to another homeowner. A friend on the next loop said their daily penalties had started ticking for a planter's issue. They got a payment portal link. It made the threat feel tangible. I wrote that down too, because money changes the temperature in a story like this. When a committee speaks in increments, it's preparing to win by attrition. At this point, the board ignored function and safety, denied my variance, and set a 48-hour window to force compliance. I had documented every inch, filed a formal appeal with evidence, and gathered neighbors' stories to prove this wasn't one person's rebellion. I pressed send on the appeal and turned to something the board hadn't anticipated: community framing. I crafted a calm, factual memo addressed to the street captains for each cul-de-sac, the people who check in during storms. It summarized the appeal, listed the postal guidance alongside the CCR rule, and asked them to consider how winter function supports the same harmony the association claims to protect. I included one photo of the bronze box after a plow pass, and one of a standard model with a frozen latch from last year, which the neighbor had allowed me to use. I asked for nothing beyond eyes on the facts. A new front arrived the next day, day 10, with a thin sleet that crackled against the windows like a whisper you can't quite catch. The management company issued a payment warning for my account, preparing for fines to commence. The phrasing was a chess move, not starting the fines yet, but setting the pawn on the square. I answered with a simple note restating that an appeal was pending, that enforcement should pause until a final determination, and that I would abide by a decision that acknowledged function along with form. I attached the certified mail receipt again, a nudge that I kept my own records tidy. Then something changed, small, but like the first pop of ice before a river breaks up. One of the street captains wrote back, not with a grand speech, but with a forward of my memo to several neighbors and a note: "Let's read this and think about how the winter standard could reflect this reality." It was not a rebellion. It was a conversation starting in daylight. Snowplows grumbled through the late afternoon, and the sleet softened into flakes that fell fat and quiet. I walked the block and noticed 3 mailboxes on our loop lined up like tin soldiers, all standard models, all iced shut. Their owners had wedged them open with sticks. The image felt like a diagram of what happens when you insist on matching parts instead of working ones. I took photos with permission and filed them, because real life has a way of puncturing appearances without raising its voice. One more document arrived before dinner, a short email from the manager acknowledging receipt of my appeal and stating that the board would consider a temporary enforcement hold while the appeal was reviewed. Would consider was not the same as will. Still, it was a new word in a paragraph that had been stubbornly repetitive. I printed the email and placed it in the folder under a tab I labeled Appeal, Hold Discussions. The social part of the story stirred. The board's high visibility enforcement relied on one person at a time feeling alone and off balance. But now neighbors were watching how this played out, and the optics weren't pretty, a committee risking winter function to keep a glossy photo consistent. If the appeal triggered a pause, the shame wouldn't be mine, it would belong to the rule that made frozen boxes a feature, not a bug. I paused there, letting the sleet's soft hiss remind me that winter rewards patience. The plan for the next move wasn't about shouting louder, it was about funneling attention toward the one place the board had refused to look, their own words about practicality and safety, married to the reality outside their windows. The appeal would force that marriage into the record. If they still wanted to levy fines, they'd have to do it in writing against both our carrier's needs and their own documents. Sunlight has a way of bleaching out obfuscation. I also understood something else. This was no longer just my little fight against a petty notice. It was the opening chapter of a broader HOA revenge story that didn't need fireworks to feel satisfying. It needed receipts, neighbors with their eyes open, and a committee that underestimated the weight of its own binder. Day 10 sleet hardened overnight, and morning cracked open with a crust that glittered under the pale sun like a sugared rind. The association's email sat in my inbox like a pebble in a boot, enforcement hold under consideration, not granted. The clock wanted to resume its march. I brewed coffee and laid my folder on the table, the way a mechanic lays out wrenches before lifting the hood. I wasn't improvising anymore. I was finishing retaliation the way winter finishes a lake, slow, steady pressure until the first clean fracture. I built a short, public-facing briefing for neighbors who asked for it, a tidy two-pager with a plain title, Winter Mailbox Function and Community Standards. Page 1 listed what our carrier needs in snow. Page 2 compared that need to the CCR Section 4.3 mailbox rule and the welcome packets practicality line. I added a final box labeled evidence and bullet-pointed what I had, the domestic mail manual excerpt, the board agenda excerpt, the final notice dated January 12, the certified mail receipt and stills from my plow video. I didn't argue. I demonstrated. Then I saved one more prop for the record, a time-stamped screenshot of the management portal's pending fines page showing, prepared, not active. A single line can tell a whole story when light hits it right. By noon, neighbors had circulated the briefing wider than I planned, and something shifted. The people who liked rules started asking about safety. The people who liked safety began to see that rules can be rewritten by the same hands that wrote them. The association's posture, tall and cold, looked less like authority and more like inflexibility. In the background hum of the furnace, I heard the rattle of a structure that had mistaken a binder for a backbone. A new clock appeared behind the old one. If the board's refusal to consider function nudged into conflict with federal delivery standards, they wouldn't just be embarrassing themselves, they would be flirting with a regulatory mess. That's not a fine you can pass quietly to one homeowner. That's a legal consequence their minutes would have to acknowledge in ink. I sent a final retaliation note to the management company, calm as a frozen pond. It summarized my appeal and requested a temporary policy statement clarifying that enforcement pauses during documented safety conflicts, citing the welcome packets practicality line and attaching the domestic mail manual excerpt again. I closed with a promise I knew they would print and file. I would comply with any rule that respects both appearance and the carrier's winter reality. I wanted the record to show I was not fighting for chaos. I was arguing for a community standard that works when the snow is deep and the nights land early. The board announced a special session for the following Monday, a narrow, buttoned-up notice with an agenda item that made my breath catch just a fraction, Winter Uniformity Initiative, Mailbox Policy Clarification. The title avoided admitting what it really was, an emergency meeting to patch a rule that leaked in cold weather, but it was enough. A street captain forwarded the notice, neighbors highlighted the line, the treasurer's sedan crept past my house twice that afternoon, the muffler's low rumble smudging the quiet. I prepared for the special session by boxing the story into 3 clean beats. First, function in winter, latch clearance after plow spray, door action with mittens, post stability in freeze-thaw. Second, compliance, my measurements aligned with the postal guidance, photographs from multiple angles, time-stamped plow stills. Third, comparability, bronze isn't neon, the cedar post satisfied the street's look while outperforming the approved model in ice. I printed this outline and clipped it to the front of the folder where anyone could see the spine of the case at a glance. Neighbors added their own small pieces. One provided a note that their standard mailbox latch had frozen 3 times the previous week. They documented the dates and temperatures. Another sent a photo of a mail carrier stepping gingerly through a churn of slush to reach a box set too close to the curb line by the association's own installation vendor. These weren't complaints, they were weather reports. They turned a single story into a pattern that even a tidy committee had to notice. The evening before the meeting, the sky went clear and black, and stars pricked the cold like pins through cloth. In that stillness, I walked to the curb and ran a mitten over the copper cardinal. The metal had bitten the chill and gave off that faint, mineral scent you catch when a key turns in winter. The small figure had become a marker for me, not rebellion, not vanity, just a sign that function can be beautiful and stubborn at the same time. Monday arrived. The clubhouse lights glowed warm as toast in the blue hour. I stayed home. With the meeting limited, homeowner comments would not be taken, but the room didn't need me physically to feel full. My packet had been disseminated, the agenda line was clear, and neighbors had routed their quiet perspectives through street captains who were allowed to attend as observers. I pressed my palms on the folder, then stepped away. Retaliation, complete. It was time for the break. The decision slid into my inbox just after sunset, and for a beat I didn't open it. I watched the pale beam of a passing car paint the icy bank with moving light, heard the soft drip where a gutter thawed at the elbow, and let one clean breath settle everything I wanted from a satisfying end. Then I clicked. The subject line read, Mailbox Policy Clarification, Appeal Determination. The email itself was surprisingly plain, almost shy about what it contained. The committee had voted to suspend enforcement of fines related to mailbox design during winter months when documented safety concerns exist, effective immediately. It had further approved a variance for my mailbox, citing comparable appearance, demonstrated compliance with postal guidance, and superior function in winter conditions. The final notice dated January 12 was rescinded. In the same motion, the board directed the Architectural Committee to update CCR Section 4.3 with a winter function clause to be presented at the next general meeting for member vote. I sat down, very still. Satisfaction arrived not as a trumpet, but as a low, sustained note that vibrated through my ribs. The board hadn't just blinked, it had conceded in writing that its binder needed to make room for weather and work. The winter uniformity push had backfired into a new standard that made sense when the temperature fell. A crackdown designed to polish the street's image had turned into a policy that would spare carriers from fighting frozen lids and homeowners from paying to replace models that fail when they're needed most. There was one more paragraph, easy to miss. The board thanked residents for their input during the review and noted that enforcement optics are secondary to practicality. It wasn't an apology. It was something better in an association context. A sentence that tied their hands to their own sense for the next time someone wanted to flex for the sake of flexing. I printed the determination and slid it into the folder, front and center, over the final notice and denial letter. I left those older documents visible beneath it, not to gloat, but to remember the shape of the fight and how it turned. Then I poured hot water into a mug, watched steam rope up into the kitchen's amber light, and allowed myself one small, private smile. The next day, the manager posted a community bulletin. It reframed the outcome as a routine seasonal clarification. Neighbors read between the lines anyway. High-visibility enforcement had met high-visibility facts and lost its shine. The carrier paused at my mailbox that afternoon and completed the delivery without a second struggle. In the quiet after the door closed, I could hear the faint tick of melting ice in the gutters like a clock resetting. Ms. V did not stop at the end of my drive that week, and I did not perform a victory lap. Petty triumphs are loud, satisfying ones are useful. What mattered wasn't that my cedar post stood, it was that the rule changed so Mrs. D's latch would open with a mittened hand, and the owners of the tin soldiers could swap them for winter-rated models if they chose without having to write a dissertation first. The treasurer's sedan passed again, slower, as if measuring a street learning how to breathe. The association announced that fines connected to winter mailbox design were cancelled retroactively for the few who had paid under the final notice window. The payment portal links vanished from those accounts. The bulletin also noted a new variance form addendum with a checkbox for safety documentation. They even added a line averaging costs. Winter-rated models may be more expensive initially but reduce replacement frequency. It was a bureaucratic way of admitting that the previous uniformity was a budget leak disguised as a standard. Neighbors reached out, not with fanfare, but with quiet thanks for doing the homework they didn't have time to do. A few asked for my briefing PDF so they could keep it for future winters. I sent it, and then I did something important. I archived the whole folder twice, one physical copy in a zip envelope, one digital scan labeled clearly, and wrote the date on the front. Memory is part of the defense against future pettiness. When power forgets its lesson, paper remembers. I also updated my notebook with the whole arc and underlined the theme at the top of the page: boundaries. Associations exist to draw lines, homeowners exist to live inside them. When the line runs through a functional path, it must bend. That was the revenge here, quiet and complete, the uniformity crusade served its own corrective, and the very people it meant to tame taught it how to be useful. Aftermath carried a soft hush, the kind winter offers after a storm has moved on and left the world blistered clean. The copper cardinal still wore a small scuff where sleet had rattled it, and that felt right. All victories deserve a mark that says the world had weather. The board posted a draft of the updated CCR Section 4.3, and members would vote on it in February. The draft's winter clause was simple: where documented safety conflicts exist, homeowners may install functionally comparable designs that meet delivery standards. The phrase functionally comparable would save more future arguments than any glossy photo ever could. The enforcement subcommittee was quietly dissolved into the main architectural group, a bureaucratic shuffle that translated, in neighborhood language, to less roaming for clipboards. The street captains expanded their winter check-ins from salt and batteries to function questions. Did the latch freeze? Did the door stick? Did the plow bury your post beyond reach? Neighbors began swapping stories of what worked rather than what matched. The cul-de-sac felt warmer in the way that has nothing to do with temperature. I kept my own costs to zero on fines and low on printing paper, but I marked down the time this took, because time is a cost too. And yet, when I looked at the folder and the draft clause, I decided the exchange rate was fair. The association had remembered its purpose. The neighbors had remembered they were neighbors. And the board had learned, at least in this small zone, that power looks better when it's humble. In my notebook, I also tucked 3 phrases to carry forward like compact tools: ask for the rule in writing, pair it with the real world, gather calm witnesses. Those are the gears that turned the crank of this little machine. It wasn't a spectacle, it was a method. For anyone tracking the genre, it scratched the exact itch that makes a satisfying revenge story feel earned without spilling over into chaos. If someone calls this homeowners association drama, I won't argue. It is, but it's also how a neighborhood grows a spine without becoming a fist. Tell me your mailbox crackdown horror in one line.